Of what I hope will be a series of talks, conversations about poets talking about specific poems. We have a lot of poetry readings, we have sort of general conversations, but to get down to the nitty-gritty of how a poem is actually kind of composed, produced, I think is particularly interesting. And I've nicked the title for this really in some ways, Poetry in the Making. I think I would link to Philip Larkin, who is always very interested in this whole idea, the process of writing poems. He was himself quite obsessed by the fact that some poems only took him half an hour. He could listen to a radio programme and then write a poem, whereas a poem like Wits and Weddings took him something like 3 years to write. And there are agonised, well, very fascinating for us scholars, kind of notebooks that go through the whole process of writing that poem. We live in a very boring age now. It seems that most of the poems that are composed perhaps are done on kind of laptops and so forth, so I don't know if there are many kind of scribbled manuscripts or that kind of information that still exists, but maybe that's something that we can talk about a little bit later. So each speaker, so that's Theo and Ren Chun, if he appears, we'll have about half an hour to talk, and then hopefully we'll have some time for conversation at the end. But Theophilus really needs no introduction. He was here quite recently. He's recently completed his time at, sounds like a prison sentence, doesn't it? Time at Raffles Institution. I'm sure it wasn't like that. He's currently doing voluntary work and other interesting work at this time, which I think we'll find has fed into some of his poetry, and as I've said, imminently is starting his national service, which I'm sure we all wish him well with. Okay, anyway, perhaps I'll just hand over to you, Theophilus, and we're going to hear about your poem Skin, how that came about. Yeah.
Hi. Hi everyone, thanks for the introduction. We'll try to keep this informal in a sense, I suppose, so I'll just talk, but okay, slightly intimidating, but okay, I'll just talk, and if there's anything we can talk about it. Yeah, okay, so, well, I wrote this poem, Skin, after a recent trip to Burma with my dad, and, hello.
Sorry.
Yep, and well, it's subtitled In Time Market Burma, and that's essentially where this took place. The poem describes, very briefly, if you haven't read it, describes me seeing a leopard skin in the market and my reactions to it. So essentially, In Time Market, it's within the Shan Autonomous Province, and the Shan State Army till recently was controlling this region, at odds with the Burmese Tatmadaw, and only recently was a ceasefire signed and the people go about their daily lives, and this area opened to tourists again. So some enterprising locals have sort of jumped on the tourist bandwagon in the sense of selling exotic things like leopard skins. But for someone like me coming from Singapore, a very sterilized, in a sense, environment where most animal skins on display are fake, coming face to face with a real leopard skin in a market, when I was browsing some of the old currency and old stamps that were on sale, coming into contact with this leopard skin, yeah, the responses are sort of channeled into this poem. So there's, I decided to sort of frame it with Craig Arnold's poem, as you'll see on the first 1.5 pages, called Bird Understander. And as was mentioned, I do some voluntary work at the Children's Cancer Foundation. So I do a sort of weekly session on creative writing with a small group of teenagers. And this was the first poem that I took to them, because I think this poem captures very nicely the idea of the poem's value in representing normally unrepresented perspectives. So in this poem, there's someone in the airport who sees a bird fluttering, and he calls the poet, or at least the narrator of the poem. And the narrator records his impression of the person in the airport telling him about the bird that's fluttering around in the airport, unable to go free. And so I introduced it to the small class of teenagers, and I asked them, who or what is this poem about? And so there were a few different answers, but most of them focused on the bird, right? The poem is about the bird that can't get free. And then I told him to consider that perhaps the poem is also about the perspective of the person who sees the bird. I think it's her helplessness with regards to the bird situation, and how that helplessness is communicated to the narrator. And finally, at the end of the poem, the narrator says, "You are a bird understander better than I could ever be, who makes so many noises and call them song. These are your own words, your way of noticing and saying plainly and not turning away from hurt." And these lines, I think, capture the idea that even though the bird cannot express its own perspective, and the person looking at the bird is helpless in looking at the bird, but that phone call itself, which is a momentary record of the person's emotions when encountering this trapped bird, that phone call itself is a form of record of both the bird's perspective and the helplessness of the observer. So communicated to the narrator can experience both the helplessness of his friend at the airport as well as the helplessness of the bird, captured in these words of the phone call. And the phone call is not intentionally meant to become a poem. The phone call is just an expression of the helplessness. But recorded like this, that is what gives this poem value, even if the narrator is unable to do anything to help his friend who is helpless or to help the bird who is even more helpless, right? So the value of the poem, finally the narrator says, "If only I could show you how very useless," meaning her words, "how very useless they are not." So the value of the poem is in recording these perspectives. So I decided to frame my poem with this, a bit egoistically on my part, I suppose, putting myself next to Kwek now. But I decided to frame my poem from this perspective because after I wrote this poem, the question that I asked myself was, what value does this poem that I've just written actually have? Not only is there the distance of, I can't do anything for the animal who's already dead or to change the situation, which is in Burma, right? I'm furthermore in a foreign land and unable to communicate very much with the locals there. So there's the added distance of the language barrier and the cultural barrier as well. And so I was thinking, what is the value of this poem that I've written? And I suppose if this poem could lay claim to any value at all, it would be the value of recording the encounter that I had between someone coming from my background and the background of this piece of skin that's laid out in front of me. Hello.
Hello, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's a little bit on the subject of the poem and what I think it can hold in terms of value. So now we can look at the poem itself. Okay, I'll read it first lah. Okay. Because I haven't really thought of what to say at first, so I'll read it first. And then, yeah.